tried out. It's going okay. Yeah, it's very different.
Good evening, everybody. Welcome. Welcome to the Frontline Club. Thank you for coming to this evening's First Wednesday discussion. There's a slight change to our lineup at the beginning. Solomon Magera from the BBC has been called on air at the last minute, so he will be joining us very shortly. But Mary Harper from the BBC has kindly said that she'll kick off the discussion as the chair and then move into a panellist position. So before we start, if I can just ask you to switch your phones to silent, and when it comes to questions, if you can wait for the microphone because we are broadcasting live. So I'll hand over to Mary.
Good evening, everybody. Thanks very much for coming, and I'm sorry that I'm not Solomon, but he'll be here very soon. I'm sure, we're all here because of something, some might not say it was fully unexpected, but this horrific attack in Kenya on the 21st of September on the Westgate shopping mall in Nairobi, which was claimed by al-Shabaab. And we're going to divide this discussion into two parts. We're going to, first of all, look at that, analyse it, look at the response of the Kenyan government and the regional and global implications of that attack. And then we'll open up to the floor and have a discussion about that. And then we'll go back to the panel and talk about al-Shabaab and its roots and what it stands for, and then have another discussion with the floor. So as things stand, we know that 67 people were killed in that attack, and the Red Cross, I think the latest figures is that 39 people are still missing. And the response of the Kenyan government, I think some people were a bit surprised, because usually whenever there's any kind of attack in Nairobi or in a region that is dominated by Somalis, there's these very quick, pretty brutal security sweeps on Somalis. But this time the language has been very different, and President Uhuru Kenyatta is talking about how the whole nation has to come together and everybody is a family, we are one. There's all this kind of rhetoric going on, which is quite different than previous responses to less dramatic attacks, which have also been blamed on Somalis. So I thought maybe we could start by looking at that, at the way that the Kenyan government has responded to this attack, and whether that's likely to, well, I don't know what people think, what the panel thinks of that. So if we could start with that, maybe Jamal, if you could share your thoughts on that.
I think, thank you very much. I think immediately when the incident happened, there were a lot of Twitter messages and Facebook calling Somalis to be dealt with. So I think, and I'm not entirely sure, but what I'm hearing is the Kenyan government talked to the Kenyan media and journalists and said, let's calm down things. We don't want to attack Somalis. So I think in that sense, they have done a very good job. But I think in the last couple of days, we have been hearing some arrests and rounding up Somalis in Kenya. So it's not as bad as we probably initially thought, because when I heard, the first thing I did was call my family members in Nairobi and said, stay indoors, don't go out, and make sure you don't get killed. So I think it's better than we expected, but it would probably happen, and they would arrest lots of Somalis, and there is a talk of deporting Somalis and all sorts of things. So,
yeah, thank you very much. And Jamal, by the way, is he works for Channel 4, and he's done a lot of work on this on Somalia. Has reported from territories where most journalists wouldn't dare to tread, and has also revealed in an exclusive report for Channel 4 on the identities, what's being said in Somalia about the identities of some of the attackers. And Hamza Mohammed is a British Somali journalist who's worked for the BBC and for Al Jazeera. And Ben Rawlance used to work for Human Rights Watch, and he's now an Open Society Fellow. And Ben, you've been working in Dadaab refugee camp, which is this enormous collection of refugee camps in Kenya, home to hundreds of thousands of Somali refugees. And what is your interpretation of the way that Kenya has responded to this attack, particularly coming from the Somali refugee community there?
Well, sorry, I spent an awful lot of time in 2007, 8, 9, 10 documenting crackdowns on the refugees every time there was some minor security incident in the northeast or in Nairobi, and sometimes even in the absence of any security incident, just because people wanted to harvest money from the refugees, or the police wanted to harvest money from the refugees. And I think there's two interesting things here. Is in the wake last week of the attack, the Parliamentary Security Committee called for Dadaab to be closed and for all the refugees to be sent home. This is a narrative which we've been hearing for upwards of 2 years, but it's been increasing in volume ever since Kenya invaded in 2011, since the two Spanish logisticians from MSF were kidnapped back in 2011, which precipitated the invasion. And I think that's predictable. What's been less predictable and welcome is the fact, as Jamal and Mary said, that we haven't seen a knee-jerk security crackdown. And although there is likely to continue to be some calls for the closing of Dadaab and for all the refugees to go home and so on, there is now a formal process together with UNHCR and the Somali government for that to happen. And Kenya has committed to doing that according to the rule of law. So I think some of that Kenya's traditional knee-jerk discrimination and sort of racial profiling of Somalis has diminished in the last couple of years, and I think that's a direct consequence of the invasion of Somalia, because it's learned the hard way that doing that gets you nowhere. It's had to actually work much harder with the refugees, with the Somali community in Eastleigh, in the northeast, on intelligence, there's been big efforts at community policing in Dadaab to try and improve relationships with the community. So I think because in fact we've already had the invasion, if there hadn't been an invasion, now there would be one. But because we've already had the invasion, I think some of those lessons have been learned, which is why there's been perhaps a cooler response.
And Hamza, you have spent the last pretty much 18 months based in Somalia, and are you surprised by what happened at Westgate?
I wasn't surprised. It was, I think, to most of us who've been to that shopping mall, it was a matter of time. It wasn't would it happen. First, the security that was in front of the shopping mall was quite, you wouldn't even find that in West End clubs, to be very honest with you. They would not take your ID cards, they would not look at it. It's just a lady and a guy with a stick that would just rub your body. Once you go in, you're free. So it did not surprise me, but what was shocking was the response and how long it took to get to the shopping mall. With that shopping mall, there's quite a large number of embassies around, and that is the part of Nairobi that, if it is secure, would be the most secure. And I think it didn't surprise me. To add to that, about police response toward the Somali community, speaking to friends of mine in Nairobi, if you are Somali and left your phone at the shopping mall, especially those who are at Art Cafe, your house would have been raided by the police by now. I know someone who's an American citizen. Her house has been trashed, and now she's in prison simply because she left her phone at the shopping mall. And I think, yes, there's been a response, but it hasn't been out there in the public.
And Jamal, what was your kind of personal response when you heard the news about what happened, what was happening at Westgate? What was going through your mind, and how did you explain to yourself what was happening?
I think on a personal level, as I said, on a personal level, you always think about your family members and your loved ones, and that's what I first did, was to call them and say, are you safe and is everything okay? And on a professional level, I think al-Shabaab have been threatening Kenya for quite some time, and there have been some sort of low-level attacks in Kenya, though al-Shabaab have not claimed the responsibility of most of these attacks. But attacking Westgate, I think it's something that I wasn't expecting it at all. I didn't think al-Shabaab would get through it and would hold on to it for as long as 4 days.
How do you explain the fact that they did manage, it was such a sophisticated attack, and they managed to kind of change the way that they were operating throughout those 4 days?
I would say that because they are quite dedicated and determined fighters. They take their time to study things, to prepare, to plan, and they are prepared to die for their causes. So I think it is that the reason they hold on to it. They were prepared to die for that, and I'm sure it took them a year, if not more than a year, to plan and put things in place and scout and do all sorts of things. So yeah, I think it's about the preparation and the planning they put into and the hard work. I think that's why they have managed to hold on to it. And also, I think some of the al-Shabaab's best snipers were in there. So any Kenyan soldier that came anywhere near them, they were just shooting them. So, and I'm sure we will hear, we haven't heard, but a lot more Kenyan soldiers, intelligence officials, were killed in the mall than we have heard.
Now my colleague from the BBC, Solomon's here,
Yes.
and Solomon, I'll hand over to you. And the idea of this discussion...
I would rather you continue, and I'll be a guest. And first of all, to apologize because I was held back because of exactly the same topic at the BBC doing an interview, because the Inspector General of the Kenyan Police let us down, and therefore there was nobody to put the story into perspective other than myself. And the reasons why he did not want to come on television, maybe it's because of the fear of, you know, contradicting further what the Kenyan government is grappling with. So I would rather you continue being the chair lady, and I will be your guest.
I'll be the chair for this half, and then I'll hand
Okay,
over to you.
fine.
And also, Solomon, have you just been in Kenya?
Yes, I was.
So maybe you can update us with the latest from the ground.
Yeah, and anyone here who's been to Kenya during that time of the attack? Ben, were you there?
I was not
Osman?
there, just
I
missed.
was there 2 days before.
2 days before. Yeah, it happened that I was traveling to Tanzania on Saturday, and as I approached Heathrow, I began to see on social media reports about an attack at the Westgate Mall. And the more you read the tweets, the more you listen to colleagues, it emerged that this was not a robbery that had gone wrong. This was something quite serious. So as a journalist boarding an overnight plane, you can imagine what was going on through my mind. I almost pushed the plane, move faster, we need to land in Nairobi and find out what's going on. So when I landed in Nairobi, I abandoned completely my trip to Tanzania. I had to go to Westlands to see what was going on and also to get a briefing from my colleagues. And you could tell this was something serious. Kenya has suffered a number of terror attacks. In 1980, when the Norfolk Hotel was hit by a Palestinian because of Kenya aiding the rescue at Entebbe in Uganda. That was in 1976. Then in 1998 was the big one, the US Embassy, when it was attacked. And then come again 2002, there were 2 attempts. One which was successful at Paradise Hotel near Mombasa, and the other one which was unsuccessful, a missile aimed at an Israeli jet. You can imagine what would have done if that missile caught that plane. And now you've got this one. But these are not the only terror in quotes attacks on Kenya. You've had so many incursions into that country. In Wajir, in Mandera, in Garissa, grenades being thrown in. You've got insurgents coming in and terrorizing Kenyan police. They will snatch them their arms and vehicles and go back into Somalia. So it's not, this you would say, coming at this time, one would definitely wonder, why Kenya? Is Kenya such a soft target for terror attacks? And these are the kind of questions people are begging. What did the intelligence know about this attack? Because when you read the papers, when you listen to experts, they say that there was intelligence, there was an attack in the offing.
Yeah, they said that since more than a year ago, there was claims, there was warnings that Westgate itself was going to be attacked.
And then you ask, who knew what, when, and what did they do? Because if it's that level of intelligence, you would expect the country's president, as the custodian of people's lives and property, to be knowing firsthand who is briefing the president. And if the president was briefed, what did he do? What did he tell the police to do? So these are the kind of questions which many people are still asking, and hoping that the commission of inquiry that has been appointed, that's going to be appointed by the president, is just announced that he's going to form a commission of inquiry. People would hope that they'll dig into these issues and at least, as a departure from past commissions of inquiry, make that report public.
And we were speaking earlier amongst ourselves, and depressingly, all four of us said that we weren't really that surprised that that attack happened. And I wonder, Ben, if you could perhaps give a bit of the context of why al-Shabaab might have felt like conducting an act like that on Kenyan soil.
Well, it started with the invasion in 2011, when Kenya, supposedly, what Kenya said was, we are declaring war on Shabaab because of kidnaps of UK citizens and Spanish citizens in northern Kenya. In fact, what was happening was a much more complicated operation. And the way I like to think of it is that there is actually no such thing as the Kenyan state, per se. There are a series of different cartels who sometimes cooperate and who sometimes compete. And one of those cartels is a connection of Somali businessmen, politicians, and then another cartel is Uhuru Kenyatta and his gang, the sort of Kikuyu business network, if you like. There's another one on the coast that does a lot of drug smuggling. Sometimes they intersect, and sometimes they intersect within the purview of the state and sometimes outside of it. And actually, from about 2008, there was this thing called the Jubaland Initiative, where a group of leading clansmen, Ogaden clansmen from southern Somalia, wanted Kenyan backing for a proto-state, a bit like Somaliland or Puntland, because, of course, the Mogadishu South Central administration is so failed. They were looking for Kenyan backing for their own situation there. And they weren't getting much traction until the Kenyan government had all of its problems with the post-election violence, when the upcoming 2012 election looked like it was in the balance, and they had the proximate excuse of these rising attacks from Shabaab. But actually what happened was those Ogadeni businessmen and the KDF, Yusuf Haji, the former defense minister, for those of you who remember him, is key in all of that. Their interests coincided with taking control of what's called Jubaland, the southern strip of Somalia, the port of Kismayo, which is key, its revenues, and then, of course, the Aulahan subclan that dominates that area of northern Kenya would deliver those seats for the Jubilee Alliance for Uhuru's party. So there's a lovely grand bargain there that made sense. At the time, we were all scratching our heads thinking, why is Kenya invading just because of a couple of kidnaps? Surely they know that they're poking the hornet's nest and the blowback is going to be huge. Now, the whole thing seems to pan out. And actually, if you look quite closely at what Kenya's actually doing in Somalia, is it going after Shabaab? No. They pushed them out of Kismayo. All of those businessmen, Ahmed Madobe, who was under Shabaab, was also in control of Kismayo when he was head of Hizbul Islam, split. Now he's no longer an Islamist. Now he's an ally of Kenya. He's still in control of Kismayo. The businessmen are still doing business in Kismayo. Shabaab is still taxing everybody in the hinterland. The goods that come from Kismayo to Dadaab have to pass through 4 different checkpoints: the Jubaland administration, the KDF, Shabaab, the Kenyan customs, and then finally the Kenyan police in Dadaab. So it's about money, basically, that invasion. And because it's about money, it's not about Shabaab. And therefore, Shabaab actually have been happily getting on with whatever they've been getting on with in southern Somalia. And that, I think, sets the scene for hopefully, a more vigorous now examination of what Kenya's actually doing in Somalia. Maybe now they will actually go after Shabaab. And if they are serious about Shabaab, that means really changing the way that they've been operating. It means being much more strict about the weakness of their officials for hard cash. And it means being much more serious and strategic about how they go about their operations there.
Jamal, would you, the southern Somalia is an area you know well, would you agree with that interpretation that Kenya's in Somalia for cash?
I think cash and more than cash, I would say, and I don't think it was mainly because of the kidnapping. I mean, they have been training clan militiamen, I think, since 2007 and 8. And training, they trained, I think, first about 3,000 and then another 3,000. So they have been somewhat planning to invade Kismayo and take over Kismayo. Because of the clan complexity of the region, northeastern frontier inhabitants and Kismayo inhabitants belong to the same clan, so they are cousins in that sense. So I think money was an issue, I would say definitely, because Kismayo is so strategic. And I think one of the reasons al-Shabaab cannot forget Kismayo is that it was so important for them. It used to bring lots of revenues. And in fact, they are so clever that they used to offer Somali businessmen 50%. If any Somali businessman wants to import goods, they used to invite them and say, if you go to Mogadishu or Bosaso or Berbera, we will charge you 50% of what other ports are charging you. So it was huge. They used to get lots of income. Also, charcoal export was another big business. So money definitely was an issue, and al-Shabaab is something that they don't easily forget. They used to get lots of money from Kismayo.
And Hamza, do you think that the Westgate attack was primarily punishment to Kenya? Or was it a way, I mean, al-Shabaab was masterful in the way that it hit an international target in Kenya. I mean, it couldn't have chosen a more spectacular target to get top media coverage in a country which is the media hub for East Africa, for all the international media outlets. And the way that it managed its information campaign was highly sophisticated. Do you think that the Westgate attack was not just about punishing Kenya, but also telling the world we're here, and a sort of way of becoming a global brand?
I think one thing I've noticed through all my years traveling in Somalia is how much people underestimate the capacity of actually Somalis and how professional they can be. Al-Shabaab are the most professional thing that you can have, and I think to a certain extent they are more professional than the armies that you see in some parts of Africa. It wouldn't be surprising if we are to find out they've been actually planning this attack for more than 2 years. And the individuals who have been planning would plan to the finer details. Then you have to look at al-Shabaab and Kenya. I think it's more personal. It's not just the attack that happened in Uganda. One of the things that we need to look at is how much territory al-Shabaab lost to Kenya Defense Forces. They've lost, I think, the biggest land territory to Kenyan forces than to any other country contributing forces to AMISOM. That's one. I think the second one that we need to look at is the amount of force Kenya used to fight al-Shabaab. They're the only country within AMISOM that have used air power and naval force. And if you're a rebel group fighting in Somalia where there's no mountains you can hide, for someone to use naval, the Navy and the Air Force, it is quite strong. And al-Shabaab, do not forget how when they retreated, the reason that they were retreating was not because of soldiers on foot. It was from air, and in Kismayo, it was the Navy that played a big part, if anyone remembers. Also, when you look at things that have been happening within Kenya, the two clerics that have died in Kenya in the last year and a half.
The radical Muslim
yeah,
clerics,
they were openly supporters of al-Shabaab.
Yeah.
To one extent, one of the clerics was sanctioned by the UN and the US for recruiting for al-Shabaab and raising funds for al-Shabaab in Kenya. And at that time, al-Shabaab did not openly say he's a member of al-Shabaab, but they were sympathetic to his to the cause. Also, when you look at Ahmed Madobe, in a sense, al-Shabaab see that he's been rewarded for abandoning al-Shabaab. He's
the gentleman who was an Islamist in control of this port city of Kismayo, and is now a friend of the Kenyan government and the Somali government, and still in control.
Yeah, so for al-Shabaab, they see the whole play and how it happens. In 2007, 2008, there was some kind of a working relationship between the Kenyans and al-Shabaab. At one time, there was cars that were stolen by bandits from in Kenya that were taken to al-Shabaab territory. Al-Shabaab actually returned the cars, and they returned the guys who stole the cars. In Mandera. Then there is recently the two Kenyans who were released by al-Shabaab, the security forces. I think one of them was district officer. They were released after negotiations. And I think this is not out in the public, but al-Shabaab see this as a broken relationship and broken promises. Negotiations do happen, and it does happen behind closed doors. So al-Shabaab and Kenya is not like any other member of AMISOM. This is more personal. And al-Shabaab also, we have to remember, see the northeastern province of Kenya as part of Somalia. It's bad enough that Kenya did northeastern province as part of Kenya, but now that Kenya went across the border to Kismayo and the whole territory, this is more personal than we see in the public.
And Solomon, before we open this stage of the discussion to the floor, what would you say to this suggestion that actually the attack on Westgate, even though it's been claimed by al-Shabaab, which has its roots in Somalia, al-Shabaab is becoming much more regionalized, especially since losing territory in Somalia. It's been focusing more on recruiting people, especially in Kenya. And for example, Jamal's report for Channel 4, where it was suggested that actually at least one of these attackers was a former Christian Kenyan. So actually it's a Kenyan problem as much as it's a Somali problem, this problem of radicalization, and it's unfair to always blame it on Somalis or Kenyan Somalis, and that Kenya itself has got its own homegrown problem of Islamist radicalization.
Yeah. In fact, just before I answer that, what Hamza was saying about the attack being personal, the fact that the northeastern parts of the country, that's the border between Somalia and Kenya, or Kenya and Somalia, the important thing to note is that that area is inhabited largely by Somalis. Now we've got something you call Somalia Somalis and Kenya Somalis. There is no difference. A Somali in Somalia is a Somali in Kenya. So how do you ever tell the difference? It's difficult. And therefore, I think it's important for, as you say, in futures to look at how Kenya deals with its relations with Somalia. Because at the moment, the other thing that could have also played into al-Shabaab's hands is the disenchantment in Mogadishu by the administration in Mogadishu, seeing what Kenya is doing in Jubaland, in that part of the world. They are not impressed by that. And to them, they will be celebrating what has happened to Kenya. That's why when President Uhuru Kenyatta was thanking or mentioning presidents who had called him to condole him and Kenyans, he did not mention the president of Somalia. Now, the question you asked about regionalization, al-Shabaab, and you all may second me on this, is no longer just a Somalia militant group, not at all. That's why you are hearing mentions of people from Norway, nationals of America, nationals of Britain involved. It has become actually international, more international than it is actually regional. So it's recruiting people in this country, it's recruiting people in America. If it's not recruiting people, as in human beings directly, it's receiving funding from these countries. And therefore that internationalizes al-Shabaab, and it's got to raise concern by people beyond Kenya, by people beyond Somalia, by people beyond Uganda. It's got to raise concern as far as this country is concerned, as far as America, Australia, Canada, and you saw some of the people killed in that attack. We had Koreans in there, somebody from Peru. It begins to show you just how globalized a terror organization can be.
And I think now if we could open the discussion up to the floor, if anybody has any questions or comments that they'd like to raise. There's one here. And if you could identify yourself, if you come from any particular organization and your name.
My name is Amal, and I'm a freelance. And as a Somali, I've got questions for... And first of all, I would like to thank the panel and all of them. Thank you very much. That was very informative. What is the popularity of al-Shabaab? What makes al-Shabaab so popular to recruit Somalis from all around the world and even non-Somalis to join them?
Who wants to answer that question? Do you
Maybe
want
Hamza?
to have a go, Hamza?
First, I think people underestimate how popular al-Shabaab are. In Somalia, for example, you can go to the site of an explosion where civilians have been killed, and if you walk down to the nearest house and ask, how angry are you al-Shabaab did this, nobody would open their mouth or say a word, if that is for fear or support. Popularity of al-Shabaab, I think, is down to the leadership of Somalia. There is no alternative that people choose. One of the things that people say to you is, you're asking me to choose between two things that I don't want. The Somali government are not up to the task, in my opinion. And al-Shabaab are what they are, everybody sees. That is one that plays a part. And then also when you see the leadership, the al-Shabaab leadership, and how they appeal to certain individuals. It's well known that they are very good when they come to speaking. One Somali government soldier said to me in Kismayo, outside Kismayo in the Frontline, he said to me, I can listen to anybody, but not the al-Shabaab leader. And I said, why? And he said, I could turn my gun to my colleagues. That's how successful in persuading people they are. And I think people underestimate. They see al-Shabaab leadership as these guys who are in the bushes or the jungles, and they think they are not educated or they cannot appeal to the average person. And to the individuals that they are appealing to, people say they appeal to people who are disenfranchised, people who have fallen off life. But I don't think that's the case. Some of the individuals who are living the Western life, these are well educated. They went to the university that most of us went to. But why? I think it is different for particular individuals. I think we cannot say kids are joining al-Shabaab because they can't find jobs here alone. I think it moves from one case to another. And that's the same thing if you go to Mogadishu prisons and stuff. You don't see, even though al-Shabaab, they've been losing a lot of ground, you don't see thousands of al-Shabaab fighters who have given up arms and saying, we are taking part of the government. Why? I think it's not as easy to explain. It's more difficult, and I think it's more complex, and it moves from individuals why they join it.
Does anybody else want to say anything about why people are attracted to al-Shabaab?
I think from people from the West, I would say initially it was more of a nationalism. A lot of youngsters joined al-Shabaab when the Ethiopians invaded Somalia initially. And then later, I think a lot of other young men joined for ideological reasons. And al-Shabaab are not probably popular with the Somali diaspora, but in the areas they control Somalia. But as far as the Somali diaspora is concerned, they are not that popular, I think.
Yeah, and I think certainly in my research into the kind of internationalization of al-Shabaab, one thing that attracted people, whether they were Somalis or non-Somalis, I mean, don't forget, just recently, an American from Alabama who joined al-Shabaab was killed by some of his fellow fighters after an internal struggle. But if you watch some of their propaganda videos and their raps.
Was not part of the indictment against the president and the defense secretary of Kenya, but it seems that clearly there's perhaps a violation of international law as well. And then also linked to that, do you think that the Kenyan government will use this attack now as a way of maybe deflecting from the prosecutions at The Hague? And there's also talk that the Kenyan parliament actually wants to withdraw from the Rome Treaty, which sets up the International Criminal Court. So I wonder if the panel can comment on that.
There are two things loaded in your question about its presence in Somalia and whether that is a violation of international law or territory. Maybe it will be up to the Somali people or the administration. Somebody then will need to file that case at the ICC for the ICC to investigate and then follow that up, and it could open that indictment if it deems fit to do so. In terms of the timing and the cases facing Uhuru Kenyatta and his deputy, William Ruto, I've written about this briefly in an article I published on BBC News Online about the challenge these two face. The thing is, when the attack happened, Deputy President William Ruto's trial was already going on, and definitely he applied for adjournment to allow him time to travel to Kenya. That process takes time. The court didn't just sit immediately and issue an adjournment on the spot. No, the court took its time to look at the application, consider it, then deliver a ruling. But William Ruto was itching to jump on the next flight back to Kenya, but he wouldn't just jump on the next flight because he's property of the ICC. And if he did that, it would jeopardize his case and his own movement. Now, he was allowed only 1 week, which was later extended to 10 days. He had wanted 2 weeks, but the court only allowed him 1 week first of all, then they added a few more days for him to attend the national prayer meeting. That must have had President Kenyatta thinking, supposing it was me, Commander-in-Chief, at The Hague in November, and this happens to my country, and I'm the custodian of people's lives and property. That is what the Constitution tells me to do as responsibility number one. What will be happening to me as a president away on trial in another country who cannot depart willy-nilly, jump on a flight from The Hague to Nairobi? No. He will have to apply for adjournment. The court will have to listen to it, consider whether it is feasible or not, and how that would interrupt the case, and then tell him, okay, Mr. President, we are allowing you so much time to try go. To avoid going to The Hague, they will have to change the Constitution first of all, to allow him not to respect an international court. Now, to do that, the Kenyan Parliament, the Kenyan government and Parliament, a political body, must call a referendum to change any part of the Constitution. Is the country ready for a referendum? No. It's a difficult one.
Yeah, I don't know. Ben, do you want to say anything about sort of possible human rights violations, illegal activity by Kenya in Somalia, even though that would obviously have to be a different case, international case?
Well, the reason why Somalia is not on the Hague indictment is because the indictment was for the post-election violence, and the International Criminal Court has not opened an investigation into the Somali situation. There's probably lots of Somalis who would like them to. The rights violations when Kenya invaded southern Somalia were quite bad. There was a lot of airstrikes on civilians. Human Rights Watch, when I worked for them, documented quite a lot. Also, naval shelling of Kismayo was pretty indiscriminate. And those are grievances, to go back to the al-Shabaab question. That al-Shabaab
and there are various reasons they join al-Shabaab, but I think one of the reasons that attracts is, as I say, al-Shabaab have when they are in the area, they have a good system. They operate like a government. They have very much everything. In the al-Shabaab areas, I remember during the famine, I was in Baydhabo, and we were leaving Baydhabo and driving fast, and one of the al-Shabaab guys stopped us, and he was a traffic police al-Shabaab guy. So, and he asked us question, and we said we don't know Baydhabo very well, and he said, since you don't know, I will give you for that, but you generally get a fine. So they have very much everything in the areas they control. They have police, traffic police. They have some sort of ministers who, all sorts of departments. And I think that attracts lots of youngsters who don't have much to do. But also, I think the other important thing is Somalis generally, as much as they fight and kill each other, they are proud, they love their country and their people, and they don't like these foreign occupiers in that sense. People might call them sort of peacekeepers, but in the eyes of many Somalis, these are foreign occupiers, in particular Ethiopia and Kenya.
They do in Saudi Arabia, but he said women in al-Shabaab areas can drive a car. In Saudi Arabia, they're not allowed to. This is an old guy who is not well educated, and he knows. And this comes from the leadership of al-Shabaab in how they put out the message. They do know what would appeal to the people. If you are a young person who finished school, it's easy for an al-Shabaab or somebody who wanted to show the African Union as a foreigner to say to you, look, these guys are not Muslims. These guys are coming from all the way from Uganda, Burundi. We don't know. They're here. Look, they drive around in big cars. You sitting there watching. And to even government soldiers, off the record, what they would say to you is, I'm earning $100. This African who comes from all the way from Burundi, Somalis sometimes do not consider themselves fully African. They consider themselves as Middle Eastern. So they would say to you, look at this African, he came all the way from Burundi. He's earning $1,000. I'm on the front line, standing here, earning $100. So for an al-Shabaab guy who recruits for al-Shabaab, they know all this information. So it doesn't take a lot to to appeal to the youngsters. And in terms of training camps, if you are in Somalia, I think every night you would hear the sound of drones in the skies. And I think the security services wouldn't know where these training camps are if they wanted to do something about it. Somalia, I think the skies of...
The court can act on its own initiative, which is what it did in Kenya, where it said, here is a case and we're going to investigate. The grievance about Somalia, I think, is well-founded. The UN has tried for many years to start a commission of inquiry, like it did a mapping report on Congo, to look at the extent of human rights violations in 23 years of war in Somalia. And none of the donors want to support it, want to fund it. Britain, the EU, the US.
Why?
Because they can't get these puppet governments that keep popping up in Somalia on board. Because none of those governments, of course, want a process like that to happen, because they'd all end up in The Hague. So there is, quite rightly, a lot of legitimate resentment against the international system and its double standards in Somalia. Huge double standards. And one additional point I'd like to mention is the corruption. Shabaab never make a public statement without talking about corruption. If you read any one of the Legion UN reports on all of these puppet governments in Somalia, it's disgusting, absolutely disgusting. The Kenyan government, the corruption in the Kenyan government is horrendous. You've got a disciplined proto-government in these states, in these areas, which is, yes, it's tough, but it's delivering. And that's very, very attractive. Two other points I'd just like to add is that I've interviewed two different kinds of people in jail who have been members of Shabaab. One are young guys who've been forcibly recruited, so let's not forget about that. Shabaab has a very long history of going to schools and just taking all the boys into the army and taking all the girls as wives. The other group is actually, as Hamza said, quite intelligent people who I would not describe as ideological, I'd describe as political. They're making a political decision. They've looked at capitalism, they've looked at the complete absence of any framework of law in Somalia, or for that matter in many other sub-Saharan African countries. And in some cases you could make the same argument about Britain or America, that the law doesn't apply equally, and therefore we're going to turn to a different framework, which is Islam, which is religion. And that is a very active, I think, political rather than ideological choice. So I would like to just add that into the discussion.
Okay, yeah. Let me take your question, and then we'll go into a little bit about al-Shabaab itself. But yes.
Yes, speaking of that last comment, as I'm listening to this, if I can be polite about this, is a certain innocence hanging over this conversation, which seems to, in a way, tie in with failures of intelligence, with, I mean, everything you've said, almost every single point, it sounds like you could say this of Hezbollah, you could say it about the coming of the Taliban and why they were popular, about the kind of blindness about all the different elements in the opposition in Syria. I mean, I've been involved in debates on Russian radio with Russians who think we're complete idiots, that we don't understand there's a pattern to all of this. I mean, the last most conspicuous is Mali, where there was this same quality of innocence. I mean, the Cairo speech was about Islam and the Arab people and the people of the region of Africa, all the way to Indonesia, taking charge of their own fate. But as you're talking about this, it sounds like a Kenya problem and a Somali problem, but this is part of a much larger movement, surely, and I think you were speaking to that. I mean,
masses are unhappy. During the British colonial times, there was the Sayyid, or what Westerners would call the Mad Mullah, who used religion to rally support. In the early 2000s, there was the warlord movements that were openly supported by the West, funded. And this is after September 11, to kind of put a lead on any sort of Islamist movement that could come up in Somalia. Then there was a group of sheikhs in Mogadishu that started the Islamic courts. Their leader was Sheikh Sharif, the president of Somalia. When the international community saw what was going on, they funded openly the warlords. Somalis knew this, Somalis saw this. What happened after that was there was mass recruitment for the Islamic courts to fight the warlords. And this was to say, we know what you've been doing for the last decade, we're not going to accept it. So the warlords were defeated by these sheikhs, including led by Sheikh Sharif, and these were not what you would call hardline. They accepted negotiations. They control most of South and Central Somalia, apart from Puntland and Somaliland. Then there was part of the movement was the warlord Indade, who made the threat against Ethiopia. That led to Ethiopia invading with the support of the West, with the funding of the West, and with the intelligence of the West to fight the Islamic Courts Union. And what happened was, when that happened, the Islamic Courts Union were crushed. The moderate leaders ran out, went to Eritrea and went abroad. What was left was the hardcore group of fighters. And that's when al-Shabaab was formed. Without the West, without the international community supporting Ethiopia's invasion, you would not have al-Shabaab. I think that's the one thing that we need to understand. The Islamic Courts, for once, every Somali was happy with the Islamic Courts Union. And that's when youngsters going from the West, going back to Somalia.
No thanks. But then in 2010, the current leader, Godani, did establish links with Abu Zubayr, the current leader of Al-Qaeda, and did establish a formal alliance. So there's a lot of commentary about whether or not what has happened recently has been informed or influenced by that. I don't know. We can talk about that till the cows come home. But perhaps I could just add something to what Hamza said about the wider context. There is a thread here that Somalia, a third of Ethiopia, or I think about a quarter of Ethiopian territory and a third of Kenyan territory, was historically Somalia. And the British and the Italians and the Ethiopian Amharas, Haile Selassie's ancestors, drew some lines in the desert and made South Central Somalia Italian Somaliland. So there is a fractured nation that has been struggling to come to terms with its kind of abandoned orphans in these other countries, who have then, of course, through the structures of those states, interfered in Somalia itself. We have a similar story in Palestine with the shenanigans of Britain and France in the colonial period. We have a similar story in Afghanistan with the Great Game and all of these very, very old, or perhaps not so old, interventions, mistakes, and in a way, incoherent interventions. The problem with Somalia was actually a lack of sustained interest. I had a wonderful conversation with an old guy in Dadaab who said, if only they'd stayed and done a proper job. and really colonized us so that we all spoke English and we were all one, and then maybe we would have had a chance as a functioning state. Now, that's probably a load of nonsense, but it's interesting that he feels that way. And I think that's the Western side of the story that underpins the more recent narrative that Hamza outlined.
And I think one thing to add on to that, and this is something that al-Shabaab really emphasize. They always say, we are the only group in Somalia who can say no to our historic enemies. Yeah. When you look at it, what they call the historic enemies, Kenya, Ethiopia, UK, America. So those are what they see as Christians, and we are the only group who can say no to them. So no matter what government is in Mogadishu, they cannot come up and say, oh, no, we can say no to Ethiopia or Kenya or UK or America.
Mali government wanted to negotiate with al-Shabaab. Are the hardliners in there going to agree to that? And there were some moves around the time of the big conference in London, the first big Somalia conference last year, where there was countries like Qatar were putting some kind of pressure on the Western powers who've been kind of trying to guide Somalia through these years of, very unsuccessfully, through these years of chaos. And the Western powers didn't like that idea. But I do wonder whether there is a role for countries like Turkey, Qatar, other Gulf states to maybe try to open some avenues. In terms of the military solution, I was thinking about Mali, because Mali, not that long ago, more than half of Mali was taken over by a mixture of radical Islamist forces and ethnic Tuaregs. And there was this rapid response led by the French, which it's too early to say whether it succeeded, but compared with Somalia, the picture in Mali is really quite different. And I do wonder whether there had been a sort of all guns blazing response to al-Shabaab, whether that might have succeeded in destroying it. I have my doubts. I mean, the Americans sent their big AC-130 planes and rained bombs down on al-Shabaab when it was a pretty small movement right down in the south near Kenya, and they just mainly succeeded in killing nomads and camels and radicalizing the Somalis into hating them more. And but then I think there are parts of Somalia, for example, Somaliland, which broke away from the rest of Somalia more than 20 years ago, where the leader of al-Shabaab comes from Somaliland. But Somaliland, it might have some sleeping cells with al-Shabaab. It has suffered a few attacks. But basically, Somaliland is a place where you can walk peacefully through the streets, whoever you are, day or night. Why is al-Shabaab not there? And I do think it's because Somaliland offers a better alternative to youth in particular. And I don't want to embarrass my friend Ayan Mahmoud, who's sitting here. But Ayan, she puts herself at tremendous risk. She organises every year a huge cultural event in Somaliland where books, music, poetry, dance, all these things that you don't associate with Somalia are celebrated, and every single event that is held during this festival is more packed than this room. And who's in there? Mainly young people. So there's an incredible thirst for alternatives to al-Shabaab, and that kind of the idea that the only way forward is violence. And I just think it's very idealistic, I know, but can't the international powers who are dominant in basically still governing Somalia and the Somali authorities that are there, can't they be a little bit more imaginative and think outside the box? Because every single time, like this gentleman was talking about the other countries, their response is like a recurring nightmare. Yeah. They just keep repeating.
I think al-Shabaab played an important part in Ethiopia's leaving the southern part, especially Mogadishu, in 2009, I think. Al-Shabaab would claim they have defeated the Ethiopians in that sense. by just bombing them from right, left, and center, and not allowing them to move in Mogadishu. But I think Ethiopia is probably a different country to Kenya. Kenya is, I would say, a free country, free movement. Somali refugees probably cannot move around, but anyone else can move around. And also, I think Ethiopia, that region we are talking about, the Ogaden region, which is inhabited by Somalis, that the Western governments have, this is not probably have been made public, but the Western governments have struck deals with a rebel movement called the Ogaden National Liberation Front, ONLF, to keep out the Islamists out of that region. So there is that agreement between the Western, the ONLF, and the Ethiopians to keep the Islamists out of the region. And Ethiopia generally is an authoritarian regime. So I think in that sense they are struggling to succeed in Ethiopia. I think that's the main reason, I think.
So any comments or thoughts about how do you deal with groups like al-Shabaab? And I don't know whether Ayan, did you say Ayan is here?
Ayan's here. Sorry, Ayan.
Oh, yes. You organize some of those events we are hearing about, which tend to appeal to young people. When you're hearing this kind of debate, something must be playing out in your mind that this should be the approach countries such as Kenya or America or Britain or Ethiopia should adapt when dealing with groups such as al-Shabaab.
I don't think you can organize a music event for al-Shabaab. I think that will be very, very difficult. But what I do think in general is people are genuinely disappointed in the West. To answer that question about Mali, I think France has decided we want to do something about Mali. We want to protect. We want to help out. But there was no one in that one country who said, okay, I feel responsible enough that I want to make Mogadishu safe. So everyone is involved, but no one is really interested. Protection. There's no protection. I think we should emphasize protection and alternative platform for young people. And for example, we were talking about the rulers of al-Shabaab. It's 30 years of investment of Saudi Arabia. While there was no education, functioning education in Somalia, luckily there's something coming. There's something in Somaliland. But the education system of Somali region, total, even in Uganda, even in Kenya, was in the hand of Saudi Arabia for 10 years. And this is the fruits that we're getting now. And the West is coming now to us and saying, actually, why are you thinking like that? 20 years immigration to Saudi Arabia, 20 years immigration back now from mid-70s when people were fleeing Siad Barre and co. So I think to understand why things are happening, we have to look into what have we really invested in human capital in Somali region. And nothing, bombs from here, bombs from there, bombs from here. And even people are surprised why you doing Hargeisa International Book Fair.
Yeah, let's hear some comments as well. Let me come to you and then that gentleman at the back.
Yeah, I'd just like to agree with that point. That was a very good point about in the absence of kind of a state and any kind of outside interest post-93, kind of the lack of an education system and then all this Saudi money. And I've found that the mentality of Somalis regarding state and religion kind of changed. And that's an issue that people don't talk about because I know that Somalis never used to, it was a secular state until the early 90s, was socialist state at that. So that kind of change in the mindset hasn't been explored enough. And also, why is the AMISOM model not being applied wider? Because it's been successful in Mogadishu. So is it a lack of money, lack of soldiers? Why are they not pushing on? The momentum seems to have been lost. So I'd just like to, why is that? Why are the reasons for that?
Whether the momentum has been lost. And the gentleman at the back.
Thank you. A quarter of century of ignorance, abandonment, and sheer right opportunism is caused what Somalia is now. We've had the ignorance of the countries who went there bombing it and killing innocent people. And then we had the sheer fallacy of landing in amphibian boats trying to create a liberation movement by Americans. Then we wonder why extremist groups such as al-Shabaab come alive. It's not because of people are ignorant to what they stand for. It's because of people of the way that their lives are. Poverty, hunger. They're very good at taking advantage of people who are in that sort of state. Al-Shabaab, Al-Qaeda, Taliban, they all look at these points and they, brotherhood, they all have their...
Westgate Cafe in 2010 for the first time was that the art cafe was out of bounds. So we've known about this for a while. We didn't see the precise nature of the attack. I think we all thought it was going to be a bomb and turned out to be something off level 15 of Grand Theft Auto. But there we are. We're up against something that won't stop, a little bit like the terminator of terrorism. Jihad and extremism wants your soul, and it's not going to stop until it gets it. So whilst al-Shabaab did originate as a nationalist, a hardline nationalist organisation to make that place less attractive to these people, and they're working as hard as they can within the situation they have to achieve that. It's not perfect by any means, but the president is an intelligent man, and he is trying very hard. I wouldn't have stayed there for so long if it wasn't getting better. But if you can think you can flick a switch and overnight this place will just improve, we're wrong. It's going to take some time. There's 20 years of political dialogue to be had. There's institution building. There's just getting the Somalis back to understanding what governance is, if indeed they remember. The Somali president spoke about growing a young sapling in his London speech. It's going to take that long. Growing a sapling in real time needs the support of absolutely everything around it to start to suck away the breeding ground that these people find so easy to operate in. But neighbours and the world must understand that as we squeeze Shabaab in one place, it's going to pop up somewhere else, just as Afghan soldiers, Afghan insurgents popped up in Mogadishu in 2011-12. As we squeeze in Somalia, as security improves there, they're going to keep moving around. So the Somali government has much to do, and it needs the support and the time to do it. But we all need to get our atlases out and start figuring out where this is going to go next, because it won't stop. And Somalia, we can improve Somalia, and we will improve it. It is getting better, but jihad, the real extremist side of this thing, is going to keep going. And if Kenya is vulnerable, then it's going to continue to work its way down the Mombasa coast.
Okay, very good insights, I think, from a colleague who's worked closely with the president of Somalia. And that's President Ahmed you're talking about, isn't it? President Ahmed, isn't it? Hassan Sheikh, yes, exactly. Yeah. And the lady here, the last comment.
My name is Nuzul. I'm a City University journalism student. I just had a question. If President Uhuru Kenyatta, it goes back to the Westgate attacks, if President Uhuru Kenyatta vaguely knew about that, obviously that Westgate was going to be under attack by terrorists, why didn't he do something about it? Why didn't he actually take extreme measures to make sure that, as a custodian of his country, of his people, to protect his people? And of course, now when al-Shabaab were in there, they segregated Muslims and non-Muslims. And how will this affect now, the post-attack, how will this affect the Muslims in Kenya now?
Jamal, do you want to tackle that briefly, yeah? Because we're running out of time. We've got about 30 seconds.
Yes, fine. There's one other thing I think that you earlier mentioned before I answer the question is the way forward. And I think, my views, negotiation is the way forward. And I disagree totally with Richard Bailey. I think you can negotiate with al-Shabaab. And the best way forward for Somalia is through negotiations. You cannot accept, and Somalis, in particular, al-Shabaab fighters will not accept foreigners coming into the country and saying the only way forward is to kill you one by one. There is no way they will lay down their arms and give up so they can be killed. And I think because of the Somali and the clan complexity, it's not very difficult to negotiate with. But my big question is the Somali president a president? And in my view, he's not in charge of the country. And he cannot decide what he wants. He cannot decide what's good for Somalia, I think.
And on that question about...
He's probably honest man, and I wouldn't doubt his insincerity, but he's not capable of, I think, achieving anything. I think your question about Uhuru Kenyatta, I am not entirely sure if the whole thing is true, whether I think people knew something were coming, but when the intelligence report through the Kenyan media were saying we knew this and that and all the details, I am not sure if that is true. I think that is primarily a blame game between the Kenyan intelligence and the Kenyan politicians, and the blame game has already started. And I think the intelligence guys wanted to get ahead of the politicians and blame them and say, we have told you so. But I think everyone knew something was about to happen, but I don't think anyone knew it would be Westgate, it would be that day, and that's what was going to happen. And I think the Muslims in Kenya, probably hundreds of Kenyan Muslims are members of al-Shabaab, and I think that al-Shabaab ideology and threat is already in Kenya. And I think, in my views, that relationship would only going to get worse from now on. And also you have to remember the Mombasa, the coastal region, the coastal people feel neglected and let down by the Kenyan government, who, they say, people from upcountry. So there are genuine grievances. And the Mombasa Republican Council are also calling to break away from Kenya. So there are lots of other complex issues which would probably play into the hands of Islamism.
Yeah, in 20 seconds, Mary, any closing remarks?
That's
from the Turkish way of handling Somalis, and
I think they're doing. I mean, they're doing great things from what I've seen. The last time I was in Mogadishu was last year, but what I saw then was impressive. It's tough, okay. I mean, I think it's really, this is the central challenge of our lifetime. That's why this is packed. That's why there's so much. There ever since international political Islam and terrorism has become a major news agenda and a major issue in the world over the last maybe 40 years. You know, even if it has antecedents before that, it has become, you know, a very, very difficult thing for us to do. And all I would urge is humility and understanding should precede action. And if there's anything that is guaranteed to make things worse, it's going to be pulling triggers before you actually know what you're firing at and what you're trying to achieve. And I think what we've seen in foreign policy terms from both the Ethiopians, the Americans, the British, AMISOM, Kenya, has been actually a failure to have a real strategic...
Now, Turkey, they see it as... they don't differentiate between UK and Turkey now, al-Shabaab. And that is evident from the attacks that happened, the last two attacks in Mogadishu. Qatar, there is the allegation that they funded President Hassan Sheikh's campaign. So that should explain to you that they wouldn't endear themselves to Qatar. The other thing that we need to realize is the military option. You may kill the fighter who carries the gun, but the ideology remains. And I think that is where people don't realize. You can go out, you can kill as many al-Shabaab fighters, but the ideology is still there. The world doesn't want to realize that when it comes to dealing with Somalia. Somalis also know continuously over the last 20 years, the international community, they sided with the people that Somalis see as bad, the warlords, the corrupt leaders. And that is not easily forgotten when you are in Somalia. Also, al-Shabaab are an option. They are less corrupt, let's face it. If you are a businessman in al-Shabaab control area, you pay less taxes. You also know that your goods will not be stolen. Also, if the most vulnerable, the minorities, if you are a woman in a government control area, the most pressing thing for you is being raped. And you know in al-Shabaab area that will never happen to you. Everybody knows that. There's no questions about that. So I think there needs to be an alternative that's better, that's more appealing to the local man in Somalia. To finish it off, this can only be overcome, in my opinion, by negotiations done by Somalis under a tree, like the way they used to do it 100 years ago.
And from me, I would say that there's a part of Nairobi that is